So in this video, we are talking about my FX30. I have had this just over a year, about a year and 2 months. And I want to give you my real thoughts of this from a working video professional on using this camera. So throughout this video, I'm going to have some different chapter markers so you can skip ahead to the different parts you want to see. Later on in the video, I'm going to be talking about my rig that you see here, how I have this built out, what parts I am using. There's some links to that in the description below as well. So starting off, why I ended up purchasing the FX30. If you follow my channel, if you follow me here, you know I have some other Sony cameras already. I've had an FX9 before. Before that, I had the FS7. I've had a few different DSLRs. I'm shooting on the A7S III now. That's been a workhorse for a few years, maybe 4 years now. I have a FX6. I just got a second FX6. So why would I go and invest into an FX30? And these are my reasonings. I was looking for a small, lighter kit to have and something to have as a secondary camera. So having as, or secondary or a third camera. Something to have as a backup, something to have to use as a B camera, because there's sometimes with the work that I do, I get hired out as a director of photography on shoots, but we also do our own projects. And there's some ongoing projects that we're working on where I have other team members that work with me that I send them out to capture things and to cover an event or to capture some footage of a, maybe a home build that we're capturing. And so I need some different rigs set up that they can take with them and do those shoots while I'm possibly away or doing another shoot as well. And a lot of times for my interviews and things that way, which I've done a video about before, why you should always shoot with 2 cameras and doing a 2-camera interview. The importance of having 2 cameras and 2 cameras that can match pretty well or really well is very important. So that was one of the factors when I was looking at the FX30. The second factor for the FX30 was actually the cost. I think it's probably one of the best bangs for the buck right now on the market for a, cinema camera. For a camera that has professional features in it. It is an awesome camera, and it's quite a bit cheaper than a lot of other things. It's more in line with those Blackmagic cameras. But if you're already in the Sony ecosystem, there's some things on the Sony that I like much better than the Blackmagic, being the autofocus being a big thing. A lot of people harp on autofocus and say you should not be using autofocus if you're a professional, but in a lot of my working world, the autofocus has been a game changer for a lot of things. Not all the time, but pretty much a game changer, and the Sony autofocus being that big player. So those were the 2 factors. I was just looking for another camera. I didn't want to spend too much money. I already had a lot of kit and things that I could build onto it. I already had a large array of Sony lenses. I already had an extra recorder monitor. So I had all those pieces there. I just needed a body, and I wanted something cost efficient. So I went ahead and bought the FX30. And when I first got it, my plans of using it was typically using it as a pretty small setup. So probably on like this, the Ronin Mini or the RS Mini. It fits pretty well on this with a small lens. Works really well and really fun with this tiny little, it's a 10 to 20 f4 lens. This only works on APS-C sensors or crop sensors. And I think that's one of the things that's holding this camera back, or what's holding it back in some people's minds, is the crop sensor on that. It always comes up, it's like, oh, well, I don't want the FX30. It has a crop sensor. And I think we start to forget that that's not that big of a deal, really. Okay, so if you look at most of cinema, if you're talking about cinematic, one of my least favorite words, real cinema, most of cinema is still shot on what would be a 35mm negative size, a crop sensor, okay? An APS-C sensor. So most of the Alexas that are being used, are the Aries, being used on those cameras, are a crop sensor. It does not make a huge difference. Yes, I do love full frame as well. But I think we get way too caught up on this. You can still make amazing images, and you can still make shallow depth of field images with a crop sensor. I think people also forget that not that long ago, a lot of us working professionals were shooting with cameras like the GH4 or GH3 or GH2. I had a GH1 all the way up to a GH4. I used it as a B camera for a lot of my Sony stuff on a gimbal, or as an interview B camera, or sometimes as a main camera on some corporate shoots when I was going off to do because it just worked and I liked it better than the images coming off of then Sony DSLRs. Before the A7S III came out and had 10-bit and stuff inside of it, a lot of the Sony cameras, DSLRs, only had 8-bit, and I found it very hard to match the colors. I found it easier to match the colors between my FS7 and a GH4. That was a micro four thirds, a much smaller sensor. And you could still get shallow depth of field with that. You could still get great looking images with that. And a lot of times, like I've talked about before in this channel, shallow depth of field is not always what you want. A lot of times it's not what you want. And I think we overshoot and overemphasize on this shallow depth of field all the time. Now, the other benefit of having an APS-C sensor is that if I'm using this as a B cam, in my interviews, typically my B cam is a little bit tighter shot. So I'm gonna use a bit more of a zoom lens. And I get a bit more of a range on a lens. So if I'm using a 16-35, which is on this right now, it's not the same, it's not as wide as a 16-35 that's on a full frame camera, but you get a little bit more room or get more length on stuff. So when I put on my 200-600, I'm getting quite a bit more out of that lens. I can shoot farther and get things closer from farther away because of that smaller sensor. There is benefits to having a smaller sensor sometimes. And if I want to have those really wide shots, a 10 mil, they're not that hard to get. And a lot of lenses you get for an APS-C are quite a bit less expensive than a full frame equivalent lens. So if you're just starting out and you don't have a big lens kit yet, the FX30 can be a very good buy because you can get into a bunch of lenses without breaking the bank. So the very first trip I went on with this camera when I first got it was down to Mexico. And I actually spent a couple mornings out with my dad who came with us. My mom and dad came with us on the trip. And he's a big fly fisherman. And we went to one of these beaches in the morning for him to do some fly fishing. Ended up finding a whole bunch of locals there that were much better at fishing than my dad in that type of water, catching tons of stuff. My dad was not catching anything, but they were also it was just a beautiful scene in the morning with the sun rising, and caught a bunch of beautiful kind of sequences of these guys kind of running around, and it gave me an idea of how I could maybe work with this camera as a documentary, as kind of a run and gun rig. At that time, I was just using the camera body itself with just the batteries in it and using this little 10-20 on it. And I also think I used the Sony 24-105 f4 as another lens and getting a little bit of longer lens shots with that. But it worked extremely well. I was very happy with it. Throughout last year, I've used this on multiple different shoots as a B camera for interviews. Matching this with the FX6 in a properly controlled lighting scenario works very well. You can match them very well. Or outside, you can match these cameras very, very well. Not too much tweaks needed over the color on them. Where this does have a little bit less of a performance, or quite a bit less of a performance, is in the low light. So the FX3, the A7S III, and the FX6 all have the same sensor. Or from my understanding, they're all the same sensor. And they both have the two base ISOs of 800 and 12,800, making those things low light beasts. So, really great using in a low light scenario. This camera does not have that, okay? The ISO ranges, the two base ISOs in this are not nearly the same as that, but you can still get some great images out of this. I also decided to get mine with the top handle because I knew I was gonna be using it in some scenarios where we needed to have a microphone on top or dual microphones on top of it, and having that configuration that way and having a thing where I could be sending phantom power to a boom mic, to a shotgun mic on top, and also having a lapel plugged in at the same time. So other jobs that this was used on, it was used on a bunch of things where other guys that were working with me had taken on for shoots, capturing stuff at some events, some other different stories that we're doing, some kind of like branded content stuff. I used it a few times by itself just as a rig like this, just wanted to have a small rig. And I wouldn't say this is my favorite camera out of all the cameras I have. I have some FX6s, an A7R5, a FX3 Mark or FS7. All these names just get me confused. A7S III, which I'm filming on right now. B camera right now is a A7R5, which is mainly a photo camera for me. Then I have two FX6s. This would not be my main go-to camera. I still would prefer to shoot on my FX6s. If I had the ability, I would prefer to shoot on the A7S III on a gimbal to match those cameras. But this as having as another camera set up and ready to go at any time for somebody else I'm working with to grab, or if I want something smaller or something to travel with, has been a great investment for me to have. And I think, again, for somebody just kind of getting into it, want to get into the Sony ecosystem, want to get into video production, this is probably one of the best bangs for a buck. Again, I know I've already said this, but I really do think that. I think it's kind of an under talked about camera. Not too many people are saying how great this thing is. It's not a super sexy camera, but it really does the job. So the rest of this video, I'm going to go into how I've built this out and how I use this. So the rig I have here is kind of a hodgepodge of some different kind of parts here. So the cage here is a small rigs cage. So it's a basic small rigs cage. From that, I have a small rigs base plate, which has 15 mil rod clamps on here. So you can put 15 mil rods on here. I have these short carbon fiber ones from small rigs as well. I can put in longer ones here if I want to have a follow focus on as well. And then I'm just using this battery plate from small rigs. What I like about this one is that I can play with this a bit. So I can move this around. I can change the configuration of it. I can close my screen here if I want to. I can bring this in much closer. Really cool if I can want to configure that to see how I'm using it. And then if I want to pop out the screen here, which I do quite a bit because I like to use the touchscreen autofocus quite a bit on these cameras, I have that available there. Now, if I go over on here in the top handle, I have another small rigs attachment here that allows for this a bit more mounting points here and a bit more secure mounting points. Then I have a small rigs articulating monitor mount here with a cold shoe adapter. That's going to an Atomos Ninja recorder. Only reason I use a recorder on this and record to it when I'm filming is I'm doing that as a backup, as a 1080p backup. I have it so it's set to trigger when I record on the camera. So I'm using internal cards on this, the CFast Express Type A cards, the ones that are used on A7S III and kind of Sony's adopted on pretty much all their cameras. I'm using those on here, and I have some very large ones. So I use that recording. I like to record internally in the camera. And then I'll do a ProRes 1080p image on here just as a backup. In case something happens to my cards, I still have a 1080p backup. It also gives me a nice thing to know when I'm recording, so it's easier to see when I get a big red box around here. Okay, then next off, V-mount. So I'm running V-mount. These are just a Cam TV, small little ones here. They work quite well. These work great. I've been using them on another gimbal as well. Yeah, it's a small kind of package, works well with this. I have a D-tap going to the monitor, and then I have another D-tap going to a dummy battery in the bottom of the camera here. So dummy battery there, so I can just turn this on. I can easily power this whole thing and get this up and going very quickly, okay? Lenses, I'm using a variety of different lenses depending on what I need. Side handle on here just to make it a little bit easier for me gripping and holding it this way. A lot of times I'm pushing the V-mount against my chest or my body and I'm holding it that way and I'm kind of looking at things that way. And then I have my hand on the lens so I can zoom or I can do focus and I can come back and touch the screen really quickly. And that's a lot of times how I'm using this, or it's on a tripod. I have Manfrotto plate on the bottom. The front of it, I have a matte box. This is the Tilta Mirage matte box. I have a few of these, really like them. It has the variable ND inside of it. So that's kind of built into the matte box. I can change that here. It's a decent variable ND. There is some color shift with this, definitely. But I really like how it works and how it goes into the matte box. I find it very clean that way. Makes it easier for me to use than a screw-on matte box or a screw-on ND filter. If I'm doing run and gun stuff, then yeah, I'm using a screw-on or a magnetic clip-on ND filter, or if it's on a gimbal, I'll be using it that way. But for this kind of shoulder-mounted thing, I like it like that. Then I have a 4x5 black Pro Mist filter on the front here of the matte box there. Pretty much on all my cameras, every time I'm shooting, I'm using a 1/8 Pro Mist pretty much on this camera's a Pro Mist right now. Pretty much use that universally. Maybe go up to a 1/4 Pro Mist on sometimes, some occasions, and occasionally no Pro Mist at all. But majority of the time on all my cameras, I have a 1/8 Pro Mist, so that's a way I can put that Pro Mist on the camera. And basically that's it. That's all the pieces to this. It's a Deity mic in the top here that I'm using. Shotgun mic. They're very affordable and great and short shotgun mic. I really like short shotgun mics for on the camera, so you're not getting that in the way of the lens. When you have a wider lens on, it's not coming into frame. It works, and it's a great sounding mic as well. So this is basically the whole kit, the whole ecosystem this way. Again, links to these different parts are in the description below. But let me know in the comments, guys, do you have an FX30? Are you thinking of an FX30? What's your thoughts on crop sensor? Do you think you cannot work with a crop sensor, that you have to have a full frame? Or do you think it's much better to shoot on a crop sensor? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Other things you'd like to see videos on. If there's something I missed here on this video that you want to know about my rig, please ask me in the comments and I will get back to you. And we'll see you guys in the next one.